Lawmakers on Tuesday debated immigration policy that impacts children who enter the country illegally with their families. The hearing comes as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the U.S. will cut the number of refugees it takes in from around the world. 30,000 will be accepted in 2019. That's 15,000 fewer refugees that were allowed in this year. It's the lowest number since 1980. John Schumo reports.
Images of separated families divided the country. Now senators are debating alternatives for processing migrants who cross into the U.S. illegally.
It is absolutely unacceptable to detain children and to have the United States of America, the strongest, best country in the world, treat children this way.
The Senate Homeland Security Committee heard testimony Tuesday on reinterpreting the Flores Agreement. The settlement reached in 1997 requires the government to release immigrant children from detention within 20 days.
I don't want to see indefinite detention. I don't think that's what we're asking. What we're saying is, give ICE the ability to detain longer than 20 days so that they don't have to make a gut-wrenching decision.
Immigration officials also defended the conditions of detention centers near the U.S.-Mexico border.
Their health and well-being is first and foremost on our mind.
The hearing comes a day after the Trump administration capped the number of refugees the U.S. will resettle next year at 30,000. That's down from 110,000 when President Trump came to office. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo praised the effort to protect refugees and the interests of American citizens.
These expansive figures continue the United States' long-standing record as the most generous nation in the world when it comes to protection-based immigration and assistance.
An estimated 69 million people are currently displaced because of crises around the world. John Schumo, CBS News.
Caitlin Dickerson is an immigration reporter for the New York Times, and she joins me now. Caitlin, welcome. You, I know, have been reporting on this issue extensively, and in a recent piece, you write that the number of children in immigration centers has spiked to nearly 13,000, which, when you look at May of 2017, is an exponential increase. What are the reasons behind this?
That's right. We're looking at more than 5 times the number of migrant children who were detained last year. And what I think is most surprising about those numbers, beyond the numbers themselves, is that we're not really seeing an increase or a dramatic decrease in the number of people crossing the border. This is in large part because children who come by themselves, they're known as unaccompanied minors, they aren't making their way out of the federal system. And that's because of changes the Trump administration has made to its process for vetting people who come forward to sponsor the children, making it a stricter process, and one that's quite frankly more intimidating to sponsors who are often undocumented themselves, so children are getting caught up in the system.
And what are some of the practical effects? It's like a bottleneck, essentially, that's happening.
It's a bottleneck which has resulted in this shelter system hovering at over 90% capacity since May of this year, so for several months. And you know, we hear from child welfare experts that keeping kids in congregate care, kind of no matter what you do to make the conditions as comforting and as sort of closely watched as possible, there's really nothing you can do to mitigate all of the damage that's done to kids when they're kept in this kind of care long term. And so we're seeing more and more kids being held in custody, and for longer and longer periods of time.
Right, because I think people may not understand these are still institutions. No matter how caring the atmosphere and the environment, it is still a very different environment than being with a family. And we know from research it shows there is, in fact, trauma and psychological pain that is suffered by those children who are in detention.
That's right, and there's a really wide range of experiences that a child might have when they come into the system, and it's sort of randomly determined what experience you get.
Right.
Some go into these facilities where you only have 10 kids living in a house. Some people are in temporary foster care, so they're really in a home, but others are in these expansive facilities, like one that the government just actually expanded, so now it can house 3,800 kids in one place, and they're living in 10 cities.
Yeah, and you, I know, Caitlin, have also been looking at the parent side of things and the parents' ability specifically to seek asylum. What is happening right now when it comes to parents who have been separated from their children who were originally coming into the United States hoping to make an asylum claim?
So the federal government conceded in an ongoing lawsuit last week that basically parents weren't given a fair shot to seek asylum when they were separated from their kids because they were going into their asylum interviews so distraught. Many of them did these interviews before they actually knew where their children were, that they weren't in a position to adequately argue their case. As you know, these asylum cases are incredibly complex. They involve really extensive interviews, documentary evidence, and parents were just too out of sorts to be able to answer the questions that they needed to. So the government settled in a lawsuit against it last week and agreed to give these parents another shot at seeking asylum.
And in your piece, Caitlin, you detailed some of the evidence that lawyers for these undocumented immigrants actually provided. What were some of the things that were presented to kind of indicate the state emotionally of these parents who had just had their children taken away from them?
I think the clearest and probably most compelling type of evidence that we heard or saw were these recordings of interviews with parents talking to judges and trying to answer their questions. The judges are asking questions to determine, exactly where did you live? What kind of persecution did you face in your home country? How can I determine that you actually qualify for asylum, which is a very specific process? And the parents literally couldn't answer the questions. There was one mother who was crying too hard to really put a sentence together. At the end of her interview, which only lasted a few minutes, the judge said that she did not qualify for asylum, but sent her to a doctor to be seen because, again, she was just so out of it, not knowing where her child was.
Just such a heart-wrenching situation. I know also as well, Caitlin, that in a recent episode of the New York Times podcast, The Daily, you talked about the reason why it has been so difficult for the government to reunite these family members that cross the border together. And it has to do with something I think a lot of folks may not have realized when it comes to the frontline sort of Border Patrol agents' options, right, when they classify people. Explain that. What happens bureaucratically from the U.S. government's point of view? How is it that they categorize the people who come into this country illegally?
So this took a while to figure out, and there were a lot of people asking, why is it taking so long to match parents and kids back together? And just to be clear, we're talking about the roughly 2,600 kids who were separated from parents when they crossed the southwest border. When that happened, when the Trump administration began separating families, it didn't create a way to repair parents and children once again. So when a person's processed along the border, they're either designated as an individual adult, a member of a family, or an individual child.
Right.
When the families were separated, rather than being classified as families, those records were changed to individual adult and individual child.
Right. We see the categories here because those families would have been adults with children, right?
Exactly.
That's the drop-down menu item for the Border Patrol agents.
Exactly. And when the adults with children category goes away, the identification number that can be used to pair the two parts back together also disappears.
So there's no way to track the children because they are now in the system as unaccompanied minors.
Exactly.
And they have their own number and their own system, and it's never the twain shall meet because that number doesn't exist anymore.
Exactly.
The family number.
Right. So this research had to be done by hand.
And so, yeah, how is that being rectified at this point?
So at a certain point, once Jeff Sessions announced zero tolerance formally, the government did create a tracking system, and that was applied to families who were subsequently separated. All those families that came basically between that announcement and President Trump's executive order stopping family separation. For the families that came in previous to that, it was really a matter of digging through old versions of records, if that makes sense. You know how you can sort of hit undo when you're writing in a Microsoft Word document?
Right.
Basically, government workers had to go into those individual records by hand, and we're talking about thousands of kids. They reviewed the records of about 12,000 kids and basically hit undo until they could find the number they needed to match parent with child.
It's just incredible to think about. That is the way in which the United States government was keeping track of, or some would argue not keeping track of, the people coming into this country. Caitlin Dickerson, thank you so much. Really incredibly important reporting. We appreciate you stopping by. Thanks.
Thank you.